He looked at her name tag, then at her scuffed shoes, and smirked. To Julian Blackwood, the waitress standing before him wasn't a person. She was a backdrop to his theater of superiority. He thought that by ordering in an archaic Provençal dialect, he could strip her of her dignity in front of his fiancée. He thought he was untouchable. He was mistaken. He didn't know that the woman balancing his wine glass wasn't just a waitress. And the words she was about to speak would not only silence the dining room, but shatter his empire. This is the story of how arrogance drowned in its own poison. The air inside the Rothwell Lounge, Manhattan's most exclusive dining room, smelled of aged Bordeaux, saffron risotto, and inherited wealth. For Aaliyah Vance, however, it mostly smelled of desperation. Aaliyah tugged at the collar of her crisp white shirt, which was too tight across her shoulders because she'd bought it a year ago when she still believed this job would be temporary. It was 8:47 p.m. on a Thursday. The evening service was reaching its crescendo, a symphony of baccarat crystal chiming against Limoges china, punctuated by laughter that cost more per syllable than Aaliyah earned in a shift. Table 3 needs their Chateaubriand carved tableside. Table 5 is complaining that the truffle shavings are too thin. Move, Vance. Move. The voice belonged to Victor Thorne, the floor manager. Victor was a man who believed that hesitation was a cardinal sin. He was currently stationed near the sommelier station, scrutinizing the wine list as though it contained nuclear launch codes. Right away, Victor, Aaliyah said, us keeping her voice steady. She lifted a tray of champagne flutes, ignoring the burning ache that radiated from her heels to her lower back. She had been standing for 11 hours. Her shoes, polyurethane knockoffs from a discount store in Brooklyn, were splitting at the seams. The right sole had separated just enough to let in moisture every time she crossed the kitchen's perpetually damp floor. Aaliyah Vance was 28 years old. To the patrons of the Rothwell Lounge, she was invisible architecture. She was the hand that poured the Montrachet, the voice that murmured the evening specials, and the body that absorbed their condescension without flinching. They didn't notice the small scar on her left temple from where she'd fainted from exhaustion 2 months ago and hit the corner of a prep table. Thus, they certainly didn't know that 2 years ago, Aaliyah had been a doctoral candidate in comparative linguistics at the Sorbonne. One of 3 candidates selected for the prestigious Maison de la Recherche Fellowship, until the international call came at 4 a.m. Paris time. Her father's stroke, the paralysis that claimed his left side, the medical debt that consumed her fellowship stipend, her savings, and finally, her future. Now she wore a bow tie and answered to Miss from men who'd never read a book they didn't skim for investment tips. She approached table 7 with the practiced smile she'd perfected. Warm enough to seem genuine, distant enough to remain forgettable. The couple seated there radiated the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. The woman, blonde and elegant in a rose-colored dress, he wore ruby earrings that caught the candlelight. The man, dark-haired, sharp-jawed, impeccably tailored, sat with the posture of someone who'd never been told no in his life. Julian Blackwood. She'd heard Toby whisper the name earlier, his teenage voice cracking with awe. He's like a hedge fund guy. Billions. With a B. Aaliyah set down the menus with practiced precision, noting the way Julian's eyes traveled from her name tag to her shoes and back again. The journey took less than 3 seconds, but she felt the weight of his assessment like a physical thing. She was being measured and found insufficient. Good evening, she began, her voice carrying the neutral professionalism she'd honed to a blade. Welcome to the Rothwell Lounge. May I start you with something from our Provençal? Julian interrupted, us not looking up from the wine list. Quelle est-ce la réserve la plus ancienne de votre Châteauneuf du Pape? Et je ne parle pas du français moderne, je parle de la langue des troubadours. Vous comprenez? The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. He'd asked about their oldest Châteauneuf-du-Pape reserve, but not in contemporary French. He'd spoken in the language of medieval Provence, the extinct dialect of courtly poets, a linguistic relic that hadn't been spoken conversationally in 700 years. Across the table, Elena shifted uncomfortably, her smile faltering. At table 4, a gray-haired gentleman in a navy suit lowered his newspaper. In the kitchen pass, Marcel, the head chef, froze mid-garnish. Julien leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He was waiting for her confusion, waiting for the moment she would stammer, apologize, perhaps fetch someone more qualified. Aaliyah felt something crack open inside her chest, something she'd kept locked and silent for 2 years. The part of her that had once debated Foucault in 3 languages. The part of her that had corrected a tenured professor on the evolution of the subjunctive mood in Occitan dialects. The part of her that had been erased, line by medical bills and 12-hour shifts. She looked at Julian Blackwood, really looked at him, and made a choice. She would stop being invisible. Just this once, she would remember who she used to be. She opened her mouth, and the Sorbonne spoke. 2 years ago, Aaliyah Vance had stood in the marble atrium of the Sorbonne's linguistics department, holding an acceptance letter that felt like vindication. At the Maison de la Recherche Fellowship, full funding, access to archives that scholars waited decades to touch. Her dissertation proposal, linguistic erasure and colonial power, the death of Occitan dialects in post-revolutionary France, had been called groundbreaking by Professor Dubois, a woman who didn't dispense compliments lightly. Aaliyah had called her father from a cafe in the Latin Quarter, her voice breaking with joy. Samuel Vance, who'd worked construction for 30 years to put her through undergrad, had cried. "My baby girl," he'd said. "My brilliant baby girl." 4 months later, that same phone rang at 4 a.m. Mrs. Higgins from next door, her voice shaking. Samuel had collapsed at the job site, a hemorrhagic stroke. The left side of his body, unresponsive. The prognosis, uncertain. Aaliyah had been on a plane within 6 hours. The fellowship money, meant for research, for conference travel, for building a career, went to medical bills instead. Then her savings. Then the fund her father had quietly set aside for her future. American healthcare, she learned, was a machine designed to devour hope. Physical therapy, $8,000 a month. The medications that kept him stable, another $2,000. The care facility that was really a warehouse for broken bodies, $6,000, and they still left him in soiled sheets for hours. Her advisor had been sympathetic, but firm. "We can defer for 1 semester, perhaps 2, but the fellowship has conditions, Aaliyah. You understand?" She understood. She withdrew. Now she lived in a studio apartment in Queens where the radiator clanged like a prisoner rattling bars. On her kitchen counter sat an envelope labeled Dad Fund in her own handwriting. $532, earned 1 humiliation at a time. It was barely enough for 1 week at the decent facility across town, the one where Samuel might actually heal instead of simply existing. She'd been a scholar once, a linguist who understood that words were power. Now she was a ghost in a bow tie, carrying other people's food, absorbing their contempt with a smile that no longer reached her eyes. She had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as anything other than service, until table 7 reminded her. Victor intercepted Aaliyah near the kitchen doors, his expression tight with the particular anxiety reserved for Very wealthy, very difficult customers. "Table 7, he said, adjusting his already perfect tie. "Handle them personally. No mistakes." "Understood," Aaliyah replied, though her feet were already screaming. "I mean it, Vance. These aren't tourists celebrating an anniversary. This is money." Victor's eyes flicked toward the entrance where a dark-haired man in a bespoke suit was handing his coat to the attendant. The woman beside him, blonde and elegant in rose silk, looked uncomfortable even in the act of arriving. Toby materialized at Aaliyah's elbow, his 19-year-old face flushed with the excitement of proximity to wealth. "That's Julian Blackwood," he whispered, nearly vibrating. "He's like $3 billion. Hedge fund. He was on the cover of Forbes last month." "Wonderful," Aaliyah murmured, reaching for menus. Sasha, the bartender, caught her arm as she passed. "Good luck," she said, her Russian accent thickening with sympathy. "That one sent back 6 bottles last month. Said our 09 Margot tasted like bourgeois desperation." Direct quote. Aaliyah watched Julian settle into his chair with the languid confidence of someone who'd never had to ask for anything twice. He didn't pull out Elena's chair. He sat first. The sommelier, Philippe, approached with the wine list. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood. May I suggest—" "No." Julian didn't look up. "Le Châteauneuf du Pape, 1998. Et ne me proposez pas de substitut médiocre." Philippe's smile froze. "The Châteauneuf du Pape, 1998, and don't offer me mediocre substitutes." The phrasing was deliberately cutting, designed to establish hierarchy. The sommelier, a man with 30 years of experience, was being dismissed like a child who'd brought the wrong toy. "Of course, sir," Philippe said, his French accent suddenly more pronounced. A tiny act of defiance that only Aaliyah seemed to notice. Elena touched Julian's hand. "That was a bit—" "I'm paying $400 for wine," Julian said, finally looking at her. "I shouldn't have to educate the staff." Aaliyah approached the table with her practiced smile, the one she wore like armor. She set down the menus with precision, her hands steady despite the warning bells ringing in her mind. This man wasn't just wealthy. He was dangerous. The kind who used money as a weapon and language as a blade. She just didn't know yet that she was about to disarm him completely. Julian studied the menu with theatrical concentration, making Aaliyah wait.